A lot of Viking related stuff lately. It's time for a change. This is my wife's original approved Mandalorian Merc costume gauntlet. It was her left gauntlet. It housed our Galaxy, I had one very similar to it. They housed our Galaxy S5s. They mounted to this back panel right here that flipped up and was hinged like that. And the camera showed through so that we could use it to take pictures. And really all we had to do with it was on our wrist, just flip it up like that, and we could press to take pictures. She didn't have any pouches on her belt. She wanted to be able to carry her phone while we were at Dragon Con, because taking pictures was kind of a big deal to us. So that's kind of how I modified them. Fast forward a few years, we now have S9 Pluses. They're too big and heavy, really, to put on the gauntlets, and the novelty has worn off. Plus, I'm redesigning her belt kit, which means that she'll have pouches again, and we'll figure out a better way. Also, with camera technology, we're talking about implementing action cams into either the helmet or the kits somewhere, so that instead of having to worry about that, we can just leave them on and then go through and cut the footage that we want out. So anyhow, I'm going to deconstruct this gauntlet and keep the clamshell, come up with something a little different. So the phone box and weapons platform base was held on with a combination of panel bond adhesive, JB weld, and tack welds. I went through and cut the JB weld off, JB weld and the panel bond adhesive, and then cut the tack welds so that I could pull the piece off, and then took a die grinder, angle grinder to what was left over from the chemical bond and the weld beads. I then scaled and printed out a mythosaur skull that was approximately the size I wanted, stuck it on a piece of board, and just cut it out. And I wasn't particularly diligent about making sure I had the lines perfect, because by the time I'm done with this thing, it's not going to be even close to perfect. Traced the rough pattern out onto a piece of 18 gauge aluminum, and I went with something fairly thin, because again, this is supposed to be lightweight, and I wanted something easy to work with. I then took a Dremel with a round engraving bit on it and just started removing metal a little bit at a time. I'd work an area and then jump around and work another area. Eventually, I had the whole thing roughed in, and I was pretty happy with the way it looked. So then I went through and kind of deepened all of the engraves and tried to get the engraving marks all running in an up-to-down type fashion so that it at least looked uniform and like it was actually worked metal. I laid out a rough outline of what I wanted it to look like, and then added 1/4 of an inch to each edge all the way around, so that was the reference point I was going to use when I started rolling the edges. And then once I had all the edges laid out, I cut it out with a pair of metal shears. I then bent the aluminum plate over a rattle can. I've got a machine that does this, but this was light enough weight metal, it was easier to do it this way. Once I had it rounded, and actually rounded a little past where I needed it to be, I took a vise and a couple of body dollies, a combination of body dollies, I guess I should say, and started slowly and gently working the edges. Ideally, I would have bolted the vise to the welding table, but the welding table's got a bunch of junk on it right now, so yeah, whatever. And then on top of that, I decided that I was going to just use these dollies freehand, and, well, anyways, I look like an idiot, but I eventually managed to make it work. I then transferred the lines onto the main body of the gauntlet to give me an idea of where I was going to need to drill the holes so that I could rivet through into the bottom plate. I then traced that pattern onto a piece of 14 gauge aluminum, cut it out with a metal shear, and used the 3-in-1 that I've got to give it a little bit of a curve so that it matched the gauntlet. Once it was curved properly, drilled the holes for the rivets in the bottom. I then welded the bottom plate to the top plate and then riveted the whole thing to the gauntlet. I then took some JB Weld and pushed it into the crevices that were left and went all the way around the perimeter of the raised platform with JB Weld to help A, hold it in place, and B, fill in the gaps. And then when I had it done, I smoothed it out nice and thing, let it sit overnight. Next morning, I came out and sanded the edges all nice and smooth. And I wiped it off with a rag soaked in alcohol and started taping up everything that I didn't want to paint in the initial pass, which is basically the top, the raised platform. That's going to get orange. The rest of the gauntlet's going to get green to match the base of the clamshell that was already there. Extra little bit of paper to make sure that I didn't get green or paint all over the other half, which was still kind of nice. So I then gave it a couple of good coats of rattle can primer. I then brushed toothpaste in strategic locations to give it a chipped and worn look. When I paint over the toothpaste and the paint dries, then I can just wipe it off with a rag and it will leave the primer gray underneath, which is the same base coat we used for the rest of our kit. I then untaped the raised platform, taped up the base clamshell, and then instead of primering first, what I did was I used toothpaste on the mythosaur to keep that the bare aluminum color. I went through the entire mythosaur, leaving the edges a little jagged and rough. Once I had that done, I shot a couple coats of primer on top of that, then went back through and used the same toothpaste to weather the edges on top of the primer. So when I shot it orange and then I could rub it off, it would be primer, gray primer underneath. After shooting it with our neon bright orange, I let the paint sit for a good while to get nice and cured, and then just buffed off the toothpaste with a rag. And then it was on to the wash, and I'm terrible with ink washes. I just mixed up a little bit of paint and some water to create a real syrupy stuff, and just dabbed it into the areas of the mythosaur and used it to darken the orange a little bit, give it a more dirty, weathered look. So I've got this bracer done. And it is pretty weathered for a couple reasons. One, our kit is 3 or 4 years old now. It's all metal, so we're not really very careful about not banging into things. In fact, quite frequently, my wife likes to bang the gauntlets and other parts of her armor into me. She's quite fond of striking me on the bucket with it. Everything is metal, so it's not like she's really going to hurt anything. It just makes my ears ring when she does that steel bucket. But from a roleplay standpoint of view, this is her weak hand bracer, so it would probably be used to fend off attacks and stuff like that. Another good reason for it to be weathered. I don't know what we're going to do with the right bracer. We may just leave it alone. It was always kind of plain anyways. Didn't have any sort of weapons platform on it. I'm leaning in the direction of doing something very similar and either putting the Talon Clan symbol on or maybe her OM number. I don't know. Maybe she won't want me to do anything to it, so maybe it'll just get left alone. Who knows?